The most expensive mistakes are usually the ones everyone agrees are impossible. 10 minutes before a $200 million deal was scheduled to close, Richard Holloway believed he was about to have one of the best days of his year. The 63-year-old billionaire sat alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows of a luxury hotel restaurant overlooking downtown Chicago. Below him, streams of headlights moved through the evening traffic. Above him, the city skyline glowed against a darkening sky painted in shades of blue and gold. On the polished walnut table rested a thick folder containing the final documents for a major acquisition. Months of negotiations. Hundreds of meetings. Endless financial reviews. All leading to this moment. In less than 10 minutes, Richard would join a video conference with attorneys, executives, and investors from both companies. One signature. One approval. One final decision. Then the deal would become official. Around him, everything suggested success. The financial press had praised the acquisition. Market analysts predicted growth. His advisors unanimously supported the investment. Even his most cautious executives believed the opportunity was too strong to ignore. The company he planned to acquire appeared healthy, profitable, and strategically valuable. Every report pointed in the same direction. By now. Richard glanced at his watch. 9 minutes remaining. His phone buzzed with incoming messages. Congratulations arrived before the deal was even complete. Investors expressed confidence. Board members shared excitement. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate. Richard leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Success at his level rarely arrived without pressure. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight felt certain. A server approached carrying a fresh cup of coffee. Her name tag read Claire Bennett. Richard had noticed her earlier in the evening because she seemed unusually attentive to details. She remembered orders without writing them down. She anticipated requests before customers made them. She moved through the restaurant with calm efficiency that suggested quiet competence. Richard barely looked up as she placed the coffee beside him. His attention remained fixed on a financial news channel playing silently on a television mounted above the bar. A scrolling market report highlighted the same acquisition he was preparing to complete. Analysts discussed projections. Charts moved across the screen. Everything appeared normal. Claire followed his gaze briefly before turning away. Then something on the television caught her attention. Her expression changed. Only slightly. Almost imperceptibly. She stopped walking. For a moment she studied the screen more carefully. Richard did not notice. He was reviewing figures on his tablet. Claire glanced from the television to the documents spread across the table. Then back to the television again. A thoughtful crease formed between her eyebrows. She seemed to be connecting pieces of information most people would never compare. Several seconds passed. Finally she looked toward Richard. The billionaire remained completely unaware. To him, she was simply another waitress in another restaurant on another business trip. Yet Claire continued staring at the financial report moving across the screen. Something about it seemed wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not dramatic. Just inconsistent. Like a puzzle piece that almost fit but not quite. Richard checked his watch again. 8 minutes remaining. He picked up a silver pen resting beside the contract folder. The polished metal reflected the city lights shining through the windows. The gesture felt symbolic. Years of experience had taught him that opportunities rarely waited forever. Decisive action separated successful investors from hesitant ones. Around him, conversations filled the restaurant. Glasses clinked softly. Jazz music drifted through the room. Everything felt relaxed. Predictable. Safe. Then Claire stepped closer to the table. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. Quiet enough that nobody else nearby could hear it. One wrong decision. Richard froze. The pen stopped moving in his hand. Slowly he looked up. Claire was already turning away as if she had not intended to speak at all. Yet the words lingered in the air between them. 3 simple words. Nothing more. But for reasons Richard could not immediately explain, they sounded less like an opinion and more like a warning. And with less than 8 minutes remaining before the largest signature of his year, the billionaire suddenly found himself wondering why a waitress had sounded more concerned than any expert he had consulted. Richard Holloway continued staring at the place where Claire Bennett had been standing. Around him, the restaurant remained exactly the same. Conversations drifted between tables. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Waiters carried trays beneath warm golden lights. Yet something had changed. 3 words had interrupted a decision worth $200 million. Richard looked down at the contract folder resting on the table. Then he looked toward the television above the bar. Financial analysts continued discussing the acquisition. Stock prices scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared reassuring. Yet the confidence he had felt only moments earlier was gone. He checked his watch. 7 minutes remained. Logic told him to ignore the comment. After all, every professional involved in the transaction supported the deal. Lawyers had reviewed the documents. Analysts had examined the numbers. Consultants had produced reports hundreds of pages long. Why should the opinion of a waitress matter? The question sounded reasonable. Unfortunately, Richard had spent 40 years building a fortune by paying attention to things other people ignored. His greatest successes rarely came from following consensus. They came from noticing unusual signals before anyone else recognized their importance. Slowly he closed the contract folder. Then he raised a hand. Claire happened to be passing nearby. She stopped. "Yes, sir." Richard studied her face. She looked calm. Professional. Completely unaware that she had just disrupted the most important meeting on his calendar. "A moment ago," he said, "you said something." Claire immediately looked uncomfortable. "I am sorry." Richard frowned. "For what?" "I should not have spoken." Richard leaned back slightly. "What did you mean?" Claire hesitated. The silence lasted several seconds. She glanced toward the television again. Then toward the financial documents on the table. Finally she spoke carefully. "Probably nothing." Richard almost smiled. "That is not what I asked." Claire looked down briefly before meeting his eyes. "I noticed something that seemed unusual." Richard's attention sharpened immediately. "Such as?" Claire pointed toward the television. "The acquisition." Richard nodded. "What about it?" She seemed reluctant to continue. "I only overheard part of the report." Richard waited. "And?" Claire folded her hands together. "The growth projections do not match the expansion timeline." Richard stared at her. For a moment he wondered whether he had heard correctly. That observation was specific. Far more specific than he expected. "How would you know that?" Claire appeared surprised by the question. "Because they showed both numbers." Richard glanced toward the television. The report had already moved on to another topic. Most people would not notice. Claire offered a small shrug. Most people were not watching. The answer irritated him slightly because it sounded both simple and true. Richard studied her more carefully now. There was no arrogance in her voice. No attempt to impress him. She simply seemed to be describing something obvious. "Explain the mismatch." Claire hesitated again. "I might be wrong." Richard leaned forward. "Then let me decide that." She glanced once more at the screen. The company claims future revenue growth based on expansion targets that require infrastructure they do not currently have. Richard felt his expression tighten. "Go on." Claire pointed toward a series of figures visible in a news graphic replay. The timeline assumes everything happens perfectly. Richard remained silent. Claire continued. That is usually where problems begin. The statement landed harder than she probably intended. Because Richard knew exactly how many investment failures began with perfect assumptions. He looked at his watch again. 6 minutes remained. Suddenly those 6 minutes felt very different than they had moments earlier. Do you work in finance? He asked. Claire laughed softly. No. Then how do you think this way? For the first time, she seemed genuinely uncertain how to answer. I read a lot. Richard narrowed his eyes. That is not a normal observation for someone casually watching television. Claire smiled faintly. Maybe not. Then she gestured toward the contract folder. But if $200 million depends on a forecast, I would want to know whether the forecast depends on assumptions nobody questioned. Richard stared at her. The restaurant sound seemed distant now. Investors trusted the deal. Analysts trusted the deal. His advisors trusted the deal. Yet for reasons he could not explain, the most interesting thing he had heard all evening came from a waitress carrying a coffee tray. And with barely 6 minutes remaining before the signature, Richard found himself wondering whether she had just pointed toward a crack nobody else had bothered to inspect. Richard Holloway did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the contract folder again and slowly turned several pages. Numbers filled the documents. Revenue forecasts. Expansion estimates. Operational projections. Assumptions stacked upon assumptions. 5 minutes earlier, the reports had looked reassuring. Now they looked different. Not because the numbers had changed. Because a waitress had given him a new way to see them. Across the table, Claire Bennett stood quietly holding an empty serving tray. She looked as though she expected the conversation to end at any moment. Richard glanced at his watch. 5 minutes remained before the scheduled signing call. His phone vibrated again. Another message from his legal team. Everything was ready. Investors were already joining the conference. Yet instead of opening the call, Richard found himself studying Claire. The situation felt ridiculous. He knew that. A billionaire delaying a $200 million transaction because of comments from a restaurant employee. If someone had described the scenario to him that morning, he would have laughed. Yet experience had taught him another lesson. Important warnings rarely arrive wrapped in authority. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Unexpectedly. Let me ask you something, Richard said. Claire nodded. Okay. Richard tapped a page inside the folder. If you think the forecast depends on unrealistic assumptions, where would you start looking? Claire hesitated. I am not saying the forecast is wrong. Richard smiled slightly. But if you were checking. She glanced down at the documents. Customer growth. Richard raised an eyebrow. Why? Because growth is expensive. The answer came immediately. Especially rapid growth. Richard remained silent. Claire continued. Everyone likes talking about future revenue. Fewer people like talking about the cost required to create it. Richard leaned back. The observation sounded obvious. Yet many billion-dollar mistakes began with people ignoring obvious things. Anything else? Claire asked for permission with her eyes before speaking further. Richard nodded. Go ahead. She pointed toward a highlighted section visible near the top of the page. Partnership dependency. Richard looked down. The acquisition target relied heavily on several large commercial contracts. What about it? Claire tilted her head slightly. If one partner changes strategy, what happens? Richard answered automatically. Revenue declines. Claire nodded. How much? Richard looked at the figures. Several seconds passed. Then his expression shifted. One contract represented nearly 28% of projected growth. He had seen the number before. Yet somehow he had never focused on it. Claire noticed his reaction. That seems like a lot. Richard slowly closed the folder. It was a lot. More than he liked. More than he remembered. His phone vibrated again. This time the screen displayed a message from his chief financial officer. Everyone waiting. Ready when you are. Richard ignored it. Claire glanced toward the television. The financial segment had returned. Analysts were discussing industry competition. One sentence caught her attention. She narrowed her eyes. That is strange. Richard immediately looked up. What? Claire pointed toward the screen. They keep mentioning expansion into secondary markets. Richard nodded. Yes. But that company announced a hiring freeze 3 months ago. Richard froze. The statement arrived so casually that it almost sounded unimportant. How do you know that? Claire seemed surprised. It was public information. Richard stared at her. You remember a hiring freeze from 3 months ago? Claire shrugged. I read business news. Then she added something even more unsettling. Expansion usually requires people. Richard felt his stomach tighten slightly. Not fear. Concern. The kind of concern that appears when scattered facts suddenly begin forming a pattern. He opened his tablet and searched through archived reports. Several moments later he found the announcement. Hiring freeze. 3 months earlier. Publicly disclosed. Easy to verify. Somehow nobody on his team had connected it to the aggressive expansion narrative dominating current projections. Or perhaps they had noticed and dismissed it. Richard checked the time again. 4 minutes remained. The city lights outside the windows reflected across the glass like scattered stars. Around him, the restaurant continued operating peacefully. Yet inside his mind, certainty was beginning to unravel. Claire adjusted the tray in her hands. I should get back to work. Richard looked up. For the first time since the conversation began, he realized she was not trying to impress him. She was not seeking attention. She was not even trying to convince him. She was simply pointing out things she believed deserved a second look. Before she could walk away, Richard asked one more question. Claire. She stopped. Yes. Richard held her gaze. Where did you learn to analyze information like this? For the first time that evening, a shadow of memory crossed her face. A quiet sadness. Gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Then she offered a small smile. That is a longer story than 4 minutes. And somehow Richard became even more curious. Richard Holloway looked at his watch once more. 3 minutes remained. 3 minutes before attorneys joined the call. 3 minutes before a decision worth $200 million became irreversible. Yet instead of preparing to sign, he found himself studying a waitress whose observations were creating more doubt than months of due diligence had produced confidence. Claire Bennett shifted the serving tray slightly in her hands. She looked as though she regretted saying anything at all. Richard could understand why. Most people would never question a billionaire's decision moments before completion. Most people would not dare. Yet Claire had not challenged him. She had challenged the assumptions surrounding the deal. There was a difference. His phone vibrated again. This time the screen displayed the name of his lead attorney. Richard declined the call. Across the table, Claire's eyes widened slightly. That seemed important. Richard almost laughed. It probably was. Claire glanced toward the exit leading back into the main restaurant. You really should not listen to me. Richard folded his hands. Why not? Claire seemed surprised by the question. Because I do not know everything. Richard smiled. Neither do the people advising me. That answer earned the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening. It disappeared almost immediately. Then Richard opened his tablet and turned the screen toward her. Humor me. Claire looked hesitant. What? Richard pointed at a revenue projection chart. If you had to find one more thing to verify before investing, where would you look? Claire stared at the graph. Seconds passed. Then her eyes moved beyond the numbers. She was not studying the totals. She was studying the relationships between them. Richard noticed. Most analysts focused on outcomes. Claire seemed focused on causes. Finally she pointed toward a section near the bottom. Customer retention. Richard frowned. Why? Claire tapped the screen gently. Because growth covers mistakes. Richard waited. Explain. She looked at the chart again. If customers are leaving faster than expected, new growth can hide the problem for a while. Richard felt a familiar sensation. The uncomfortable feeling that accompanies a question everyone should have asked earlier. And if growth slows? Claire looked up. Then the hidden problem becomes visible. Richard immediately searched through supporting reports. Several moments later, he located retention figures buried deep inside an appendix. His expression hardened. The numbers were not catastrophic. But they were weaker than headline reports suggested. Significantly weaker. He sat back slowly. Claire noticed the change. Did I find something? Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued reviewing data. Retention declines. Hiring freezes. Expansion assumptions. Partner dependency. Individually, none of the issues seemed devastating. Together, they formed a pattern. A pattern nobody had highlighted. A pattern that suddenly felt difficult to ignore. The city lights beyond the windows reflected across the glass like scattered diamonds. The restaurant remained peaceful. Yet Richard's certainty continued fading. Claire. She looked up. Yes. What did you study? The question lingered between them. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Economics. Richard blinked. You studied economics? She nodded. For 3 years. Richard stared at her. Suddenly many things made more sense. The observations. The pattern recognition. The language she used. None of it sounded accidental anymore. What happened? He asked quietly. Claire smiled politely. The kind of smile people wear when discussing old disappointments they have already accepted. Life happened. Richard recognized the answer immediately. Not because it explained anything. Because it explained enough. Before he could ask more, his tablet rang. This time it was not an attorney. It was his chief financial officer. Richard answered. Richard, everyone is waiting, the voice said. Are we proceeding? Richard looked across the table at Claire. Then at the reports. Then at the city beyond the glass. For the first time all evening, he did not know the answer. That realization alone was enough to concern him. Because certainty had brought him here. Doubt had arrived only minutes ago. Yet somehow the doubt felt more honest. Richard took a slow breath. Then he spoke 4 words that shocked even himself. Delay the signing meeting. Silence filled the line. Are you serious? Richard never looked away from Claire. Completely serious. After ending the call, he placed the phone on the table. Across from him, Claire looked stunned. Richard offered a faint smile. Congratulations. Claire frowned. For what? Richard glanced at the untouched contract folder. You just bought yourself more than 3 minutes. Now tell me everything I am missing. Claire Bennett remained standing beside the table, still holding the serving tray. For a moment she looked as though she might refuse. Not because she lacked confidence in her observations, but because she seemed uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Richard Holloway noticed the hesitation immediately. It was different from the behavior he normally encountered. Most people became eager when a billionaire asked for their opinion. Claire looked as though she wished she had never started the conversation. "I do not know what you are missing," she said quietly. Richard almost laughed. "You have already found 3 things my advisors overlooked." Claire shook her head. "I found 3 things that made me curious." Richard leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like the same thing." Claire smiled faintly. "Not really." Then she placed the tray on an empty chair beside the table. For the first time since the conversation began, she sat down across from him. Outside the windows, Chicago shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Inside the restaurant, evening dinner service continued around them. Yet Richard felt strangely disconnected from everything except the discussion unfolding at his table. Claire glanced once more at the acquisition reports. "Can I ask a question?" Richard nodded immediately. "Of course. Why do you want this company?" The simplicity of the question caught him off guard. For several seconds he said nothing. Nobody had asked him that in months. Analysts asked about valuation. Lawyers asked about risk. Investors asked about returns. Nobody asked why. Richard folded his hands together. Market position. Claire waited. And growth opportunities. Claire continued waiting. Richard smiled. "You are not satisfied with those answers?" Claire shook her head gently. "Those sound like presentation answers." Richard laughed softly. She was right. They did. After a moment he answered more honestly. "Because I believe they can become a major player in the industry." Claire nodded. "And if they cannot?" Richard frowned slightly. "Then the investment performs below expectations." Claire looked toward the documents. "Or maybe the investment depends on becoming something they are not." The sentence settled heavily between them. Richard stared at her. Once again, she had transformed a complicated financial discussion into a simple question. Not whether the company could grow. Whether the company was being evaluated based on reality or possibility. He opened one of the reports and reviewed several pages. Suddenly he noticed how often future success depended on words like expected, projected, anticipated, and forecasted. Claire watched him quietly. "There is another thing," she said. Richard looked up. "What?" She pointed toward a section discussing international expansion. "Everyone keeps talking about what the company will do." Richard nodded. "Yes." Claire tilted her head. "What does the company already do exceptionally well?" Richard opened his mouth to answer. Then stopped. The question sounded simple. Yet he struggled to find a clear response. Revenue growth was obvious. Market enthusiasm was obvious. But exceptional operational strength? That answer was less clear. Claire noticed the silence. "That worries me." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "Because great companies usually have something undeniable." She searched for the right words. "Something that remains valuable even if growth slows." Richard looked down again. The acquisition target had exciting potential. Exciting forecasts. Exciting narratives. Yet Claire seemed focused on foundations instead of promises. The distinction made him increasingly uncomfortable. His phone buzzed once more. This time it was his chief financial officer again. Richard answered immediately. "Tell me something," he said. "Have we stress-tested the retention assumptions against the hiring freeze?" Silence followed. Then came the response. "Not specifically." Richard glanced toward Claire. "Do it." Another pause. "Right now?" Right now. After ending the call, Richard placed the phone face down. Claire appeared surprised. You are really investigating this? Richard smiled. You would be amazed how much money has been lost because nobody asked uncomfortable questions. For the first time all evening, Claire laughed. A genuine laugh. Warm. Brief. Then her expression became thoughtful again. There is one more thing that bothered me. Richard felt his attention sharpen instantly. What? Claire looked toward the television. Financial news continued playing silently overhead. The executives being interviewed. Richard frowned. What about them? Claire paused. They sounded more excited about selling than building. The restaurant seemed to disappear. Richard stared at her. Because suddenly he remembered something he had ignored months earlier. Something small. Something easy to dismiss. Yet now, for the fourth time in less than an hour, a waitress had pointed directly toward a concern he could no longer pretend was insignificant. Richard Holloway did not speak for several seconds. Claire Bennett's last observation continued echoing in his mind. They sounded more excited about selling than building. The sentence seemed almost unfair at first. Yet the more he thought about it, the harder it became to dismiss. During months of negotiations, he had spent countless hours studying financial reports, projections, and market opportunities. Far less time had been spent evaluating something simpler. Whether the people leading the company still believed in what they were creating. His phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. The voice of his chief financial officer sounded different than before. Less confident. More cautious. Richard, we found something. Richard sat forward. Across the table, Claire watched quietly. What did you find? A pause followed. The retention assumptions are significantly more aggressive than historical performance. Richard felt his jaw tighten. How significant? Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. Enough that projected growth becomes difficult to justify if customer turnover increases even slightly. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Another piece. Another crack. Another assumption that looked strong from a distance but weakened under inspection. Anything else? The silence lasted longer. This time. Yes. Richard immediately recognized the tone. Financial professionals only used that tone when delivering news they wished they had discovered sooner. Go ahead. The partnership concentration risk is worse than we realized. Richard glanced toward Claire. How much worse? The answer arrived quietly. One contract influences nearly a third of projected expansion revenue. Richard slowly lowered the phone from his ear. Hours earlier, that information would have sounded like a technical concern. Now it sounded like a warning. After ending the call, he sat silently for a moment. The city lights outside continued sparkling against the night sky. The restaurant remained warm and inviting. Yet the deal that had seemed so certain earlier now looked increasingly fragile. Claire studied his expression. Bad? Richard exhaled slowly. Not good. Claire nodded. She did not appear surprised. That bothered him more than the news itself. You expected this. Claire shook her head. No. Richard frowned. Then why are you so calm? A faint smile appeared. Because uncertainty is normal. Richard stared at her. Most executives spent enormous amounts of energy pretending uncertainty did not exist. Claire seemed comfortable acknowledging it. You really studied economics, he asked. Claire nodded. University of Illinois. Richard raised an eyebrow. That is a strong program. It was. The past tense caught his attention immediately. What happened? Claire looked down at the table. For a moment she seemed far away. Somewhere beyond the restaurant. Beyond Chicago. Beyond the conversation. My father got sick. Richard remained silent. Claire continued. My mother was already working 2 jobs. Her voice stayed calm. Matter of fact. Someone had to help. Richard understood immediately. So you left school? Claire nodded. 1 semester before graduation. Richard felt an unexpected sense of loss. Not for himself. For her. He imagined what might have happened if circumstances had been different. The analysts he hired. The consultants he paid millions. The executives who occupied glass offices. Claire belonged among people like that. Yet life had redirected her path. Did you ever go back? He asked quietly. Claire smiled. Not sadly. Not bitterly. Just honestly. There was always another bill. Another responsibility. Richard looked toward the acquisition folder. $200 million sat inside those pages. Yet somehow the conversation felt more important. You know, he said, most people would be angry. Claire laughed softly. At who? Richard considered the question. He had no answer. Claire looked toward the restaurant floor where families shared meals and conversations. Life does not always ask permission before changing your plans. Richard stared at her. Again, the wisdom arrived without effort. Without performance. Without ego. Then his phone vibrated one more time. A new message from his chief financial officer appeared on the screen. Richard opened it. His eyes narrowed instantly. Attached was a preliminary internal review. Across the top, highlighted in red, were 6 words that changed everything. Additional undisclosed liabilities under investigation. Richard slowly looked up. Across the table, Claire noticed the change in his expression. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire began to wonder whether the danger hidden inside the acquisition was far larger than anyone had imagined. Richard Holloway continued staring at the message on his phone. Additional undisclosed liabilities under investigation. 6 words. Yet they carried enough weight to threaten an acquisition that had seemed untouchable only an hour earlier. Across the table, Claire Bennett remained silent. She did not ask what the message said. She did not lean forward. She did not attempt to prove herself right. That restraint somehow made Richard trust her even more. Most people rushed toward validation. Claire appeared almost uncomfortable with it. His phone rang again. This time it was not his chief financial officer. It was the chairman of the board. Richard answered immediately. Richard, what is happening? The chairman asked. Half the executive team is waiting for an update. Richard glanced toward the contract folder. We are reviewing new information. Silence followed. New information? The chairman sounded confused. From where? Richard hesitated. For the first time in his career, the truthful answer felt absurd. Finally he said, from a different perspective. The chairman clearly did not understand, but Richard ended the call before further explanations became necessary. He turned his attention back to Claire. Tell me something honestly. Claire nodded. Okay. Richard folded his hands together. When you first saw the report on television, what bothered you most? Claire thought for a moment. The question seemed important to her. She wanted to answer carefully. Finally she spoke. Confidence. Richard blinked. Confidence. Claire nodded. Too much of it. Richard leaned back. You lost confidence because people sounded confident? A small smile appeared. Not exactly. She looked toward the television. Financial commentators were still discussing various market stories. Real confidence usually leaves room for uncertainty. Richard listened carefully. Go on. Claire pointed toward the screen. Everyone discussing the acquisition sounded certain. Richard understood immediately. Markets were rarely certain. Businesses were rarely certain. Investments were never certain. Yet the public narrative surrounding the acquisition had become unusually unanimous. Claire continued. Whenever everybody agrees, I start looking for what nobody is discussing. Richard felt a chill of recognition. The statement echoed one of the earliest lessons he learned as a young investor. The best opportunities often existed where consensus was weakest. Likewise, the greatest dangers often hid where consensus felt strongest. Before he could respond, another message appeared from his chief financial officer. Richard opened it instantly. A new report had arrived. Preliminary review complete. Potential liabilities substantially exceed previous disclosures. Richard read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The city lights beyond the windows suddenly looked different. Colder somehow. More distant. The acquisition was no longer showing isolated warning signs. The warnings were beginning to connect. Claire noticed the change in his expression. Worse? She asked quietly. Richard nodded. Much worse. She lowered her eyes toward the table. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Concern. Genuine concern. I am sorry. Richard stared at her. Why are you apologizing? Claire offered a faint smile. Because I know what it feels like when plans fall apart. The answer carried a depth that suggested experience. Richard wanted to ask more questions about her past, but another thought had become impossible to ignore. For over an hour, Claire had identified issue after issue using nothing more than public information and simple reasoning. His own team had spent months analyzing the deal. Yet she kept seeing things they missed. Claire. She looked up. Yes. Richard hesitated. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind all evening. If you were sitting in my chair right now, would you sign? The restaurant noise seemed to fade. Even Claire appeared surprised by the question. She looked toward the contract folder. Then toward the glowing skyline outside the window. Finally she answered. No. Richard felt his pulse quicken slightly. Why? Claire took a slow breath. Because every new answer tonight created two new questions. She met his eyes. And when questions multiply faster than answers, I stop moving forward. Richard stared at her. The simplicity of the statement felt devastating. Around them, the evening continued as normal. Yet for the billionaire sitting near the window, one realization had become impossible to escape. The deal he had planned to celebrate might actually become the most expensive mistake of his career. And the deeper his team investigated, the more likely it seemed that Claire's first warning had only revealed the surface of a much larger problem. The call came just after 9 o'clock. Richard Holloway answered before the first ring finished. Across the table, Claire Bennett watched quietly. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It changed the way a clear sky changes before a storm. Slowly. Inevitably. How much? Richard asked. Silence followed as he listened. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Are you certain? Another pause. The answer on the other end seemed to remove any remaining doubt. Richard thanked the caller and ended the conversation. For several seconds he simply stared at the dark screen of his phone. Around them, the restaurant continued operating normally. Customers laughed. Glasses clinked softly. A server carried desserts toward a nearby table. Yet Richard felt as though he were sitting inside a completely different world. Claire waited. Eventually she spoke. What happened? Richard exhaled slowly. My investigation team found the liabilities. Claire said nothing. Richard continued. Not only were they real, they were larger than the preliminary estimates. He looked toward the acquisition folder resting unopened on the table. A lot larger. Claire lowered her eyes. There was no satisfaction in her expression. Only concern. Richard almost appreciated that more than anything else. Most people would have focused on being right. Claire seemed focused on the consequences. His phone buzzed again. Another message arrived from his chief financial officer. Richard opened it and read carefully. Updated projections now estimated that if the acquisition had proceeded under the original assumptions, losses and impairment costs could eventually exceed $200 million. Richard read the number twice. Then a third time. $200 million. The exact amount everyone had been so eager to invest. The city lights beyond the window reflected across the glass like scattered stars. Earlier that evening, those lights had looked beautiful. Now they looked distant. Almost unreal. Claire noticed his silence. That bad? Richard nodded. Worse. He showed her the message. Claire studied the screen briefly before handing the phone back. Her expression remained calm. I am glad you waited. Richard laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the alternative suddenly felt terrifying. One signature. One decision. 1 hour earlier, he would have approved everything without hesitation. The realization stayed with him. Eventually he asked the question that had been growing in his mind all evening. Claire, how did you see it? She looked genuinely confused. See what? All of it. Richard gestured toward the reports. Everyone involved in this deal had access to more information than you did. Claire thought about the question. Then she smiled faintly. Maybe that was the problem. Richard raised an eyebrow. Meaning? She pointed toward the stack of documents. There was too much information. Richard listened carefully. Claire continued. When people have thousands of pages, they focus on details. She glanced toward the television. I only saw the big picture. Richard stared at her. Once again, the explanation sounded simple. Yet simplicity often hid wisdom. Claire folded her hands together. The numbers were impressive. Richard nodded. They were. The story was impressive. Richard nodded again. It was. Claire looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. But the pieces did not fit together. Silence settled between them. Comfortable silence. Honest silence. Finally Richard smiled. You know, my board is never going to believe this story. For the first time all evening, Claire laughed freely. The sound was warm and genuine. I probably would not believe it either. Richard looked at the acquisition folder one last time. Then he closed it completely. The deal was over. Not delayed. Not postponed. Finished. Somewhere inside a conference room, executives would be disappointed. Investors would ask questions. Analysts would speculate. None of that mattered. What mattered was that a mistake had been avoided before it became permanent. Richard glanced at Claire and realized something else. The most valuable insight of the evening had not come from a consultant, an attorney, or a financial expert. It had come from a waitress who simply refused to ignore a question that everyone else had stopped asking. And for the first time that night, Richard began wondering whether saving $200 million was only part of what Claire had changed. 1 week later, the headlines arrived. The company Richard Holloway had nearly acquired announced a series of financial disclosures that shocked investors across the industry. Analysts who had praised the acquisition only days earlier suddenly changed their tone. Market confidence disappeared. Shares fell sharply. Questions multiplied. Investigations expanded. Commentators searched for explanations. Richard watched the coverage from his office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Every report confirmed the same conclusion. If the acquisition had closed on schedule, the losses could have exceeded $200 million. He turned off the television and stared out the window. The city looked exactly as it had the week before. Yet everything felt different. Not because he had avoided a financial mistake. Because he could not stop thinking about the person who had prevented it. Later that afternoon, Richard left his office without informing his assistants where he was going. 40 minutes later, he walked through the doors of the same restaurant. The dinner crowd had not yet arrived. Sunlight filtered through the windows, painting long golden reflections across the floor. Claire Bennett stood behind the counter organizing receipts. She looked up and immediately recognized him. Surprise crossed her face. "Mr. Holloway." Richard smiled. "Claire." She set the papers aside. "How are things?" Richard laughed softly. "Much better than they would have been." Claire smiled. "I saw the news." Richard nodded. "Then you know." For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Familiar. Finally Richard placed a folder on the counter. Claire looked at it but did not touch it. "What is that?" Richard folded his hands. "An opportunity." Claire blinked. "For what?" Richard looked directly at her. "For someone who sees what everyone else misses." Claire immediately shook her head. "I am not looking for charity." Richard expected the response. In fact, he respected it. "Good," he said. "Because I am not offering charity." Claire studied him carefully. Richard continued. "Over the last week I spoke with analysts, executives, board members, and consultants." He smiled faintly. "Do you know how many of them identified the problems before they appeared?" Claire already knew the answer. Richard continued anyway. "None." The restaurant grew quiet around them. You saw warning signs using public information, common sense, and questions nobody else bothered to ask. Claire looked down briefly. "I was just paying attention." Richard nodded. "Exactly." He pushed the folder toward her. "Most people underestimate how valuable that is." Slowly, Claire opened it. Inside was not a check. Not a gift. Not a reward. Instead, she found information about an analyst development program inside one of Richard's companies. A position. A salary. Educational support. Mentorship. And something else. Full tuition assistance to complete the degree she had been forced to leave years earlier. Claire stared at the pages. For several seconds she said nothing. Richard noticed her hands trembling slightly. "You remembered." His smile softened. "Of course I remembered." Claire looked away, blinking rapidly. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "Why?" Richard considered the question carefully. Then he gave the only answer that felt honest. "Because talent should not depend on circumstances." The afternoon sunlight continued filling the restaurant. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine hummed softly. Claire looked at the folder one more time. Then at Richard. "This changes everything." Richard smiled. "No." Claire frowned. Richard gestured toward her. "You changed everything." For the first time since they met, neither of them was thinking about the acquisition. Neither was thinking about money. The most important outcome of that evening had never been the $200 million that stayed in Richard's account. It was the moment one person chose to listen instead of assume. Because wisdom does not always arrive from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet question from someone the world forgot to notice. And those are often the voices worth hearing most.